Today I'm going to talk to you about participatory culture, which is a concept that I've been exploring and developing over the last 20-something years. So I was writing about participatory culture before the internet, or at least before the internet hit most people's lives. And for me, I always draw a distinction between participatory culture and participatory media or technologies. In this talk, I'm going to be talking very much about that concept in relation to new media literacies, but also and primarily in relation to civic engagement. And this is work that's been funded in recent years by MacArthur Foundation, by the Knight Foundation, and most recently by the Annenberg School of Journalism and Communication. I'll begin with a story, and this is the story of Peter. And Peter lives in New York, so he's a resident not too far from here. He lives with his aunt and his uncle. Peter considers himself to be a master of the webs, and he's involved in a great deal of adolescent identity play. He's got multiple identities, multiple ways of seeing himself and acting upon the world. Peter uses social network sites to connect with his friends, including people at a nearby private academy that he has strong ties to. And he's also an amateur photographer who's begun posting his photographs online, and his photographs have been so good that they've gotten the attention of the local newspaper, and he's beginning to publish his photographs there. He also is deeply invested in his community and takes action, both individually and collectively, to make the world around him a better place. His uncle is fond of noting that he has in his hands more power than any previous generation could have imagined. And with great power comes great responsibility. By now, you've probably guessed that my Peter, in this case, is Peter Parker, better known as Spider-Man. And I framed the beginning of my talk in that way to make a point, which is that in our imaginations, we readily accept the idea that young people do things in the world that matter, that young people can take responsibility and change the world around them, that young people are active social agents, and that young people need space to pursue those interests, and those interests need to be taken seriously. It's also begun the story this way because I want to illustrate the ways we can use popular culture as tools and resources to think with and to think about the changing environment around us. So one of the things that's changed about Peter Parker in the time that I've been a comic book fanboy is that Peter Parker once needed to be deeply embedded in a newspaper. Indeed, all superheroes were tied to systems of large-scale communication in order to get access to information with which to make sense of the world around them, to identify problems and acted upon them. And increasingly, they've been dispersed. That Peter's lost his job recently at the newspaper. He doesn't need it anymore. He's got access to the internet, and indeed, more and more Peter Parker gets his information about the world streaming through digital technology channels. Second thing about Peter Parker is that Peter Parker belongs in a society where adults and young people relate to each other as equals. Right? There's a lot of talk about digital natives and digital immigrants. For me, the important point is that, in fact, the really successful stories are places where young people and adults meet each other on equal footing based on common interests. And it's a good thing that Peter's not judged by his age, given that Thor is about 400, 500 years old. All of us look young by the standards of Thor sets. And Peter makes mistakes. His aunt looks after him and follows up behind him, but he's able to take risk and pursue interest with an adult that looks over his shoulder, watches his back, doesn't snoop over his shoulder. This is all part of what I call a participatory culture. So for a white paper I wrote for MacArthur about 4 years ago, I got interested in the fact that the Pew Center for Internet and American Life was showing at the time about 58% of American teens had produced media. Today, the number is about 65% of American teens. About a third of those teens have shared that media they produced with a community larger than friends and family. So there's a communication shift that's going on as more and more young people are becoming participants in their society. Now, we didn't accept the premise that we should just take a laissez-faire attitude, that these should be feral children of the internet and they should, be raised by the wolves of Web 2.0. Instead, we suggested that there were basic skills and knowledge they still needed to acquire, and we identified 12 social skills and cultural competencies in this white paper needed to fully participate in this new environment. Now, this is the way we normally represent these sets of social developments through technologies, right? This chart shows us 3 phases of technological development, and the logic of that argument is that participatory culture somehow grows out of those technological platforms. Well, I want to take us back to Web -10. The 1850s, young people were using toy printing presses to publish what we would now call zines, which were circulating around the country. There was a national circuit, the Amateur Press Association. These teens developed sort of codes and initials, phrases like LLL, that they were used because they had to hand set the type in printing out these publications. And many of the terms we now use in the internet trace their history back to that period of time, these social networks, these virtual communities that existed around print. We could carry the notion of participatory culture forward. This is only one of many multiple histories of participatory culture, to the amateur radio operators of the 1920s, where schools, Boy Scout troops, churches operated their own radio stations, and young people took ownership of communication resources in their own community. We could carry it forward through the science fiction community, which began by about the 1930s to be publishing its own zines, providing cultural criticism, speculating about the limits of science and technology. And forward still to the underground press of the 1960s, which became the key voice of the counterculture. Or forward to Super 8 and camcorder activists who were using those technologies to build social networks again and make a difference in the world. And forward to the indie movement, which used radio and the web to again create alternative channels of communication. That's the history I think we should pay attention to. Not the history of technologies, because what we see here is this community, these people, participatory culture, took advantage of every new technology as it was presented as a vehicle by which to participate, to engage with the world, to make a difference in their community. Now, through the MacArthur work, I make the case that participatory culture is a rich site of informal learning. Because there are low barriers for engagement, strong support for sharing creations with others, informal mentorship, members believe their contributions matter, they care about each other's opinions of self and worth. These are key ideas. Now, by the way, the slide illustrates the idea of participatory culture, because a couple of years ago, I punched that phrase in the Google search, and up came this slide. Someone had taken my white paper, turned it into an image better than the one I would have used, and so ever since I've used it in my presentations. And that's precisely how participatory culture works. We throw ideas out into the world, we bring them back in an improved way because of our engagement with communities. So a couple of years ago, I was in Chile and met this guy who's a Senator Fernando Flores Labra, who looks, as you can see, like a Latin American senator. But the difference is that he's an absolute passionate player of World of Warcraft and believes that World of Warcraft holds the key for thinking about the future of Latin America. That he believes that young people connecting online with each other, collaborating, forming teams, developing leadership skills that work with people around the world who they may never know face to face, holds the potential for inserting Latin America more decisively into a global conversation. Now, we can think about what he has to say about World of Warcraft with what Robert Putnam told us about bowling. That is, Robert Putnam tells us in the 1950s, the bowling league was the center of civic life in small-town America. People gathered to bowl, but they also had a range of other conversations that took place around that practice. And the social network that emerges from that becomes key to political engagement in the period that is to follow. Now, he has a kind of dire, downward turn look at these things, but I think we want to revisit his arguments, not in terms of television, but in terms of the internet. And I would argue that whatever is going on in World of Warcraft, it's not bowling alone. That this group of people, like the group of bowlers before, is a community which has taken mutual interest in each other, extending beyond what's in the game to the larger parts of their lives, that this becomes a meeting point and a place of exchange, only it's an exchange not rooted geographically, but rooted on a global scale. What we've seen is that games are an enormous platform for various forms of civic and political activism, whether it's the Ron Paul movement using World of Warcraft, to this massive protest that took place in one of the multiplayer games in China, a protest that probably couldn't take place in physical space, at least post Tiananmen Square, but can take place in a virtual environment. That games have become a platform by which people are expressing their political concerns. This is part of a larger picture, right? Many of you have seen the studies that show that young people get more of their information about the world through popular culture, including comedy news shows like these, rather than through traditional journalism. And as someone in a journalism department who cares greatly about the future of journalism, this worries me. As someone who cares about the future of civic engagement, it doesn't worry me nearly as much. Because these shows often represent alternative perspectives that are not in the mainstream news. They critique the frame of news. They dig into the archive and present images and contextualize things in ways that traditional news have not. As platforms for thinking about the world, they're doing really important work. And they're part of this larger way in which the line between participatory culture and public participation is starting to break down. Now, this is not new. Again, thinking historically, we can argue that previous generations' ideas about democracy were also shaped by popular culture. Here we see Norman Rockwell's covers for Saturday Evening Post and Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington as earlier forms of popular culture that taught people things about democracy, that embedded the logic of democracy into the practices of their everyday life. And we could go backwards and forwards in time, forwards to rock music and underground comics, backwards to the Tea Party, the original Tea Party, where people were playing dress-up and dumping tea in the carver, building on carnivalesque traditions from old Europe. And we can go forward to the present moment, where, in fact, we're seeing the mobilization of participatory culture by groups like Move On around the Obama campaign, and to sort of think about where do the people get the skills that allow them to produce videos for Obama that circulated on YouTube. And in many cases, it may have been people learning how to film themselves skateboarding. It may have been gamers using machinima. It could have been any number of popular culture, participatory culture practices that taught them those skills. Just as in a hunting society, we play with bows and arrows. In an information society, we play with information. In a mediated culture, we play with media. And that play, in fact, becomes a powerful form of teaching. Now, that play is now being harnessed by new kinds of political organizations, like this one, the Harry Potter Alliance, which the founder of it, a 20-something named Andrew Slack, starts from the premise that Harry Potter is a story of a young man who questioned authority and changed the world. That he lived in a world where the newspapers lied about what was happening, the government refused to acknowledge real problems, and his school suppressed political speech, but he organized his classmates into the Dumbledore's army and went out and changed the world. And he said, that's a powerful image for young activists. So if we had a Dumbledore's army today, what would they do? Who would they work with? And he works with both fan groups, like Wizard Rock groups, like This is the Harry and the Potters. He works with Free Press and Amnesty International. He's organized around human rights issues, around worker rights issues, around gay marriage. He wrote me this morning to say that they had raised enough money to support 3 cargo planes to Haiti, named Hermione, Harry, and Ron, that are delivering supplies down there to make a difference in that community. He does it with, he's got now 100,000 young people around the world who are involved in civic activism in the name of Harry Potter. A pretty remarkable set of developments. We're seeing the popular culture leads to new kinds of political awareness. This group, Ain't White, now known as Racebender, organized in response to the filming of a version of Nickelodeon's show Last Airbender, in which all of the people of color were recast by white actors. And they've organized to call attention to the whitewashing of characters, the sort of racial politics of casting. This is extended from a focus on one anime series to a whole variety of issues, and these are teenagers and young adults educating themselves about race in America. They can come right through your door. This is a group called the Living Room Rock Gods, who just try to duplicate the keyboard skills, the drumming skills of their favorite rock performers, put it out on YouTube. But predictably enough, if they get close enough to the original, the technology that tries to see if they're pirating shuts them down. It's a point of pride, but also a point of anger. And so they've organized this group, Tribute is Not Theft, to call attention to the politics of copyright, take down notices, and so forth. This is the more traditional group, Invisible Children. It's an activist group concerned with Uganda, but it's taking the language of popular culture, participatory culture, in order to engage young people with political change. So it borrows from Michael Jackson, from High School Musical, from reality television. It produces what Stephen Duncan would call ethical spectacles that are participatory, transparent, playful, but mobilize people on an ongoing basis, not just to give their time and money, but to actively engage with a relationship with the developing world. Now, we've seen signs of this start to leak out of this. This image up here of the Joker Obama originated on a site in a community called 4chan that, in fact, just spit out lots of variants on the Joker tied to different political figures. For them, it was a game. Can we make memes? Can we spread them out to a larger population? This one got picked up, has been on the national news. It's sort of become a rallying point for conservatives in America. But what it does is translate politics through a language of popular culture. It gets us out of the policy wonk discourse and into something that's much more engaged with things people already know and care about. Now, what comes around goes around. We can see during the campaign that supporters had depicted McCain as the Joker, as the Penguin, and Obama as Batman. We've seen that there were images during the campaign that made Obama into Spock. We've seen that the comic book world has connected Obama in a variety of ways to the figure of the superhero. And we see that, in fact, Obama himself is sort of played around with that analogy. So the language of the superhero comics and of science fiction has become a way that we make sense of our fanboy-in-chief. Now, this is a global phenomenon. Some of you saw the other day in the news a protest march in Palestine where people dressed up like the Na'vi from Avatar. And in fact, across many parts of the world, there have been already protest marches similar to this one where people paint themselves blue. Now, on Twitter, we paint ourselves green, but it's more or less the same thing. And this idea of connecting to using the language of James Cameron's films to speak back to power. This is a protest march in Singapore where there are prohibitions on public gatherings, and so people came one by one and plopped down an action figure to stand in for them as a figure of protest. And that over there, believe it or not, is a rally about a pop idol in India. That around the world, we've seen pop idol becomes a centerpiece for debates about democracy. Now here I hear a lot about more young people voted for American Idol than voted in the last election. Not true, by the way. More votes cast, but if you could speed dial in the last election, I think, and vote as many times as you wanted, there have been a lot more votes in American politics. But what's interesting is that around the world, Pop Idol has become a franchise that sparks debates about democracy, so why hasn't it happened here? That may say more about our culture than it says about the franchise. So where does that leave us? These groups are mobilizing skills kids have, knowledge they care about, passions they have toward new causes, but our schools are locking out many of these practices. Our schools are turning down Wikipedia, shutting off YouTube, blocking social network sites. And this, I think, is a challenge for those of us in this room. That if we think what I've described here works on an organizational level to mobilize citizenship, shouldn't we bring it into our classrooms? So I end there.